What's happening, everybody? Joe Nice, always live, direct, in effect, coming to you on a February 11th, 2021, February 11th, 2021, February 2021. And I'm not talking politics today because, quite honestly, I don't feel like it. I'm not talking politics. I'm not talking, any weird racism. I'm not talking about any of that stuff today because, as I spoke about earlier on my Instagram live video that I did while I was wrapping up my workout today, I wanted to let everybody know that today's been 9 years since one of the greatest singers of all time, Whitney Houston, passed away. It's been 9 years. And it doesn't seem like 9 years has gone by, but it has. And I vividly remember exactly where I was when I heard the news that Whitney Elizabeth Houston passed away tragically. I remember exactly where I was. I had played 4 shows in 4 days across almost across the Canadian Maritimes. Let me restart that again, because I did a Wednesday night show at Reflections Cabaret in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And if you know about Reflections Cabaret in Halifax, Nova Scotia, it's one of the best venues ever. The next night, I played a show in St. John's, Newfoundland. And I'll never forget that show because it was super freezing cold outside. There was at least 30 centimeters of snow that had fallen that night, maybe a little bit more. And I remember I flew on an airline that I'd never heard of before, an airline called Porter Airlines. And Porter Airlines is one of these regional Canadian airlines that doesn't go, I think, any farther west than Timmins, Ontario, and has a couple of international flights to the United States, one going to Midway Airport, one going to, I think, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And I think Porter Airlines also flies in and out of Dulles International Airport just outside of Washington, D.C. So Porter Airlines landed, played the show, got up early that next morning, flew back to Halifax, and then played a Friday night show in Sydney, Nova Scotia. And if you've ever been to Sydney, Nova Scotia, there's not a whole lot going on in Sydney, Nova Scotia. It's a town of maybe 30,000 people. The airport is one of the smaller airports that I'd ever been to. And this is a town of 30,000 people, and 150 people showed up for that night. So needless to say, we packed out that bar, and it was wild. And then the next morning, I got up super early that morning, took a flight from Sydney back to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Halifax to Pearson Airport, which is one of the 2 airports in Toronto, and then Toronto all the way out to Winnipeg, where I was going to play a show in Winnipeg on Saturday with my guy Theo, out to Theo, and the rest of the crew out there. So the plane landed. It was an Air Canada flight. The plane landed. I got off the airplane. I turned on my BlackBerry. I didn't have a smartphone back then. I didn't have an iPhone. BlackBerry with the keypad and the big button in the middle. And in Winnipeg's airport, there are TVs at every gate. So, and this is my, I think, 3rd or 4th time being in Winnipeg. And for some inexplicable reason, every time that I've been to Winnipeg, it's always been in February. And if you know anything about Winnipeg, or as the locals there call it, Winterpeg, it is always cold in Winnipeg, especially in the wintertime. Always. So I remember turning on my BlackBerry and then waiting for the Wi-Fi to get activated so I could communicate with Theo so he knew where to pick me up. And when I looked up at the TV and then I looked at my Twitter feed, R&B singer Whitney Houston dead at 48 years old. I'm like, come on, man. No way. Stop it. Stop. And then in the airport at every gate, there are TVs. I know one of the TVs would show you what gate you're at and what the departing flight is and what the arriving flight is going to be. The TV next to it was showing nothing but Canadian Broadcasting Corporation television. And they had their version of the CBC. But in every major city, the CBC has their own broadcast. So they'll have one for Vancouver. They'll have one for Winnipeg. They'll have one for Calgary. There'll CBC Edmonton News. They'll have one for St. John's, Newfoundland, and Halifax, Nova Scotia, Toronto. Montreal, they'll have it, but it'll be in French. So they had one just for Winnipeg. R&B singer Whitney Houston dead at 48. I'm like, no way. and they showed the picture of her in the bathroom, I think in a hotel where she died of coronary heart disease and I think cocaine intoxication. I saw that news on my Twitter feed. I saw it on my on the TVs there, and I was inconsolable. I was like, there's no way Whitney Houston is dead at 48. Come on, man, no way. So I looked at a couple, and Twitter, when there's trending topics, they'll list the top trending topics that people are talking about. And it's usually 10 topics. Sometimes it might be a few more. Everything that night was about Whitney Houston. Everything. Everything. I was married at the time. Actually, was I married at the time? Let me think about this. Yes, I was married at the time. I was married at the time. My wife at the time called me. She goes, "Joe, did you hear the news?" And I'm like, "Yep, Whitney's dead. I can't believe it." She goes, "Joe, I can't believe it either." And I'm like, "Look, I'm going to lose the phone signal soon," because I was going to walk outside. I was like, "I'll just call you. I'll call you tomorrow morning." And and I told Theo the news. He couldn't believe it. I was crying in the airport. There were people who I remember seeing watching in the airport, watching the news, and I'm standing next to perfect strangers, and we're all looking up at all of these TVs around. People at bars when you walk by. There are people getting Timbits and coffee at Tim Hortons in the airport, just in complete disbelief and shock. Whitney Houston is dead? No way. Come on, stop. This is Whitney Houston. And yeah, I remember I got back to the hostel where I was staying that night, and typically what I'll do when I get somewhere, before I go ahead and play a set somewhere, I'll go ahead and get a quick nap, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, but nothing really longer than that, because then that just completely throws me off. I just laid in the bed and looked up at the ceiling, and I just couldn't truly comprehend what was happening. Whitney Houston is dead. There's no frigging way. And for any of you that watched this past week's episode of the Joe and Cat Chat series, we talked about Black people and music. Black people and music. And we talked about one of the singers that was featured prominently in the discussion Kat and I had was Aretha Franklin. We talked about Aretha Franklin. And I didn't grow up knowing everything about Aretha Franklin, because quite honestly, Aretha Franklin was a generation, or in some cases 2 generations before my time. But I knew about Aretha Franklin later on in life. I knew about early 80s Aretha, especially the Get It Right album, which is an incredible album, and the Jump to It album, which came out in 1982. Both of those albums were produced by Luther Vandross. And then the other song she had, "We're Gonna Ride on the Freeway of Love in a Pink Cadillac." That was late 80s Aretha. But the stuff she did in the 70s, 60s, and especially the stuff in the 50s and some of her gospel work, I really didn't know that stuff. I had to go back later in life and learn a lot about that. But with Whitney, it was different. Whitney, if you're between the ages of 30 and 50, you grew up. Whitney Houston was the Aretha Franklin of our generation. That is who Whitney was. Now, there have been some amazing singers that we've seen, especially that triumvirate of female singers that we had in the late 80s and early 90s, really more 90s. You had Mariah Carey, and let's not forget, Mariah Carey's first album came out, I think, in 1990. But with the black background and all that hair she had, that was 1990 or 1991. So just when you think that Mariah Carey's been around for about 15 or 20 years now, Mariah's been around a lot longer than you think, or maybe some of you all are willing to admit. And the other singer that completed this triumvirate of legendary female singers in the 90s is Celine Dion. Celine had hits. And don't fool yourself. Celine had some hits, and she could sing it all day and all night. But Celine, Mariah, and Whitney. And Whitney was Whitney really got her start a little bit before both of them, but you knew who Whitney was. And Whitney came from a musical family. Her mother was Cissy Houston. And Cissy Houston was a famous background singer for Aretha Franklin. She was a famous background singer for her aunt, Dionne Warwick. And Dionne Warwick is Dionne Warwick. Everybody knows about Dionne Warwick. One of Dionne Warwick's cousins is a lady named Leontine Price. And if anybody knows about classical music, Leontine Price was the first Black woman to ever perform at the Metropolitan Opera, otherwise known as the Met, in New York City, New York, United States of America. So Whitney Houston came from a musical family. She came from a singing family. She, much like all of the other singers that we discussed in episode 35 of the Joe and Cat Chat series, came from the church. She grew up singing. She grew up singing the gospel. One of Whitney Houston's albums, The Preacher's Wife, which is a gospel album. And let's not forget, Whitney Houston didn't start off singing gospel and then transitioning to pop and R&B. She came out of the gate as a pop singer. Let's not kid ourselves. Whitney Houston later in life did The Preacher's Wife soundtrack. The Preacher's Wife soundtrack is the greatest selling gospel album of all time. Amongst all the great gospel singers we've had over the past couple of 100 years, and some of the legendary gospel albums that we've had for generations, the greatest selling gospel album of all time is The Preacher's Wife soundtrack, recorded by none other than Whitney Elizabeth Houston. I turned 45 years old in about 5 weeks. So I grew up saving up my allowance, cutting grass, or mowing, or raking leaves, or shoveling snow to buy tapes and or eventually records. Whitney Houston, and again, where I went to grade school, I grew up around, quite honestly, I grew up around a whole lot of white folks. And I remember some parents or some friends of mine when I was growing up telling me, you know what? I never knew that so-and-so listened to a lot of Black people's music, but I really like this Whitney Houston lady. She's really nice. And 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 I remember people saying to me, you know what? I don't know if I was okay with so-and-so having a picture of of somebody from your kind on my wall, on my son or daughter's wall, but I'm okay with Whitney Houston being on my son or daughter's wall. And here I am thinking that I'm thinking this. I'm like, okay, but then as I got older in life, I'm like, you racist fucking bastards, you racist assholes. Do you realize your ignorance? And then I guess as I'm saying that now, I didn't realize my own ignorance because I guess I didn't know any better. I didn't know any better. And part of so much of what we think about, especially back in the early to mid 80s, was influenced by what we saw on television. And what we saw on television musically, there was really only a couple of ways to get it. You had VH1, but of course you had MTV. So if MTV didn't sign off on you, you somehow were invalidated. You somehow were a little bit less than important. Somehow you weren't as cool. You weren't as talented. You weren't as quote unquote pop and or mainstream. And let's face it, MTV had a lot of influence on what people consumed, what people wore, what people thought. And let's realistically, the first Black person to really get pushed popularly and strongly on MTV was Michael Jackson. And Michael Jackson's talent was undeniable. There was you couldn't stop him. Michael was a force of nature. Let's pay him the respect he deserves. Michael was a force of nature. His greatness was undeniable. His destiny was to be something that everybody was going to remember for generations and generations. There was no stopping Michael. None. But the first Black woman, And I purposely say black women because there were plenty of white women that got plenty of opportunities on MTV. Look at Madonna. Look at the Bangles. Look at Pat Benatar. Look at Joan Jett. Look at Blondie. But the first, look at the Go-Go's and Belinda, and then later on Belinda Carlisle. And you're fooling yourself if you didn't know the words to "Heaven Is a Place on Earth." That song was incredible. With all those globes that Belinda Carlisle had in that video, amazing. But Whitney was the first black woman to really get pushed on MTV. She was it. Then at that point, it was like, wait a minute, black women can sing pop music like this? Knowing black women had been singing pop music long before VH1. There were plenty of them, but it was more R&B rather than strictly pop that quite honestly was digestible and consumable for white folks, especially the white mainstream media and the white establishment. Once Whitney got popular, Janet came in, and then Janet just blew the doors off the place. And one of these days, I'm going to do one of these conversations about Janet. I might do it on her birthday, which is, I think, May 16th. She turns, I think, 55 years old then. So we'll talk about Janet when it's time. But the only other woman that got her stuff played strongly back in those days in the early 80s, early to mid 80s on MTV was Sade. And Sade wasn't trying to be pop. Sade was just Sade. She was her own thing. There's a reason why I have her face tattooed on my left shoulder, right over here. If you want to see what it looks like, go through and look through my Instagram. And after my main man Tyler Tattoo for hooking that up. If you want any good tattoos, go see him at Froggy Style Ink, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Get your ink done there. But Whitney paved the way for other black women who weren't necessarily trying to be pop to get played on MTV. And then VH1 came out. What about Anita Baker? Wow. Obviously, we talked about Janet. What about Sherelle? What about Angela Winbush? Angela Winbush. Look up some of those Renee and Angela albums. And then Angela's 2 solo albums after that. Amazing work. What about Regina Bell? What about Stephanie Mills? We could talk all day long about this stuff, everybody. But again, we're paying our respects to Whitney. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember the Super Bowl from 30 years ago, the 1991 Super Bowl, when Whitney sung the national anthem. And Whitney blew the doors off the place, if you can have doors in an open arena. And I think the Super Bowl that year in 1991, I want to say it was Buffalo versus the Dallas Cowboys, if I'm not mistaken. I know late 80s, early 90s, Buffalo went to 4 straight Super Bowls, so we know Buffalo was in them. It was either Buffalo versus the Cowboys, Dallas Cowboys, Buffalo versus the San Francisco 49ers. Was one of those 2 teams. But yeah, Whitney sung that anthem, and you felt something when she sung those words. You felt something. She had that tracksuit on with the American flag. You felt something when Whitney hit those notes. You felt something. And much like I said in the Joe and Kat Chats episode that we talked about earlier this week, the best of Black people and music, it comes from that historical legacy of storytelling. It comes from education, and it comes from a place inside here And it comes from expressing the deepest of human emotions. And the deepest of human emotions, we all understand, is that four-letter word called love, Love. Look how many songs Whitney sung about that referenced love. You give good love. You know, from the Bodyguard soundtrack, I Will Always Love You, which was a song originally written by Dolly Parton. Of the first album, Saving All My Love for You. You know, also off the first album, You Give Good Love. Amazing song. Amazing song. You know, she talked about, when we talk about love, we talked about in the episode of Joe and Cat Chats, I said, hey, it's about expressing the emotions. It's about, as I mentioned, about that Frankie Beverly song, Joy and Pain, Sunshine and Rain. Whitney expressed that also. Whitney said, where do broken hearts go? Will they find their way home? Whitney said, didn't we almost have it all? And when Whitney lost that love, she said, I want to run to you. Will you stay or will you run away? You know, Whitney sung, I have nothing. She said, I have nothing if I don't have you. Don't make me close one of my doors. I don't want to hurt anymore. Stay in my arms if you dare. Or must I imagine you there? Don't walk away from me. No. Don't walk away from me. I have nothing, nothing, nothing if I don't have you. Almost makes me tear up just thinking about it and saying these words off the top of my head. Whitney said, I get so emotional, baby. Every time I think of you, I get so emotional. Ain't it shocking what love can do? I'm every woman. It's all in me. Anything you want done, baby, I'll do it naturally. What does that sound like? What does that sound like? Sounds quite reminiscent to what Aretha Franklin said maybe 30 years prior. You make me feel like a natural woman. When Whitney put on that purple dress and she wasn't wearing a bra and she had that weave that was a little bit too big for her head and all those extensions, and she clicked those flaps in the video, when she said, I want to dance with somebody. I want to feel the heat with somebody. Yeah, I want to dance with somebody who loves me. I don't care what anybody says. 11-year-old Joe with the Arnold from Different Strokes Caesar haircut with no shape up and the rugby shirt and the Bugle Boy pants and the kangaroo shoes with the Velcro straps and the quarter in each side pocket, firmly believed that Whitney Elizabeth Houston was singing that song to me. When she said, I want to dance with somebody. I want to feel the heat with somebody. She was singing that to me. She was singing that to an 11-year-old Joe, and I had no idea what she meant, but I was like, okay, I'm all about Whitney Houston. Then as she got older, she said, whatever you want from me, I'm giving you everything. I'm your baby tonight. Ah, man. When you used to buy records um, uh, or tapes back in the day, and then eventually CDs, you had different genres of music. You had rock, pop, heavy metal, classical, big band, whatever. You had all your different genres of music. And you go into your record stores like Sam Goody or Waxy Maxie's, if you're from around this area, Kemp Mill Records. And you would go in and say, hey, look, where can I find Whitney Houston? Where can I find Whitney Houston? Because you typically had all your funk and soul in one place. So you had your Earth, Wind and Fire, your James Brown. You kind of had all that together. Then you had all your pop music kind of in one place. Culture Club, Boy George, Wham, George Michael, Madonna, Michael, Prince. Even they would be kind of just tossed into pop. Then you had all your music. Then you had your R&B kind of in one section. New Edition, Alexander O'Neill, Dennis Edwards, Saida Garrett, to a certain extent Stevie. Barry White. It's all kind of in that area where you heard a lot of Black people and their music. Whitney was her own section. Whitney was her own thing. Whitney wasn't R&B. Whitney wasn't pop. Whitney Houston was Whitney Houston. And if you wanted Whitney Houston, you had to go to a section in the store to buy Whitney Houston. That was Whitney. That was Whitney. And she's been gone 9 years. I could not imagine that this is kind of the beginning stages in 2012 of what social media is now. Could you imagine how? And I told my daughter, she's 10, and she knows Whitney Houston songs. Girl's 10. Girl's 10. And when we talk about singers now, like let's say for example Justin Bieber, right? I'm like, baby girl, you can't imagine how famous some of these singers were in 1985 or even 1995 or 1990. It's just a different level of fame. It's a completely different scope and scale of being a legend. Or as my guy, main man Eugene in the chat says, a true legend. Out to you, Eugene. Please give my best to Maria. Not everybody in Leeds, England. I miss you all terribly. Out to main man Simon. Out to everybody in Leeds. Out to the West Indian Center. Out to Freedom Mills. But Whitney was just another scope of fame where you can't even buy her stuff in the R&B section or in the pop section. It's in the Whitney Houston section. It's in the Whitney Houston section. And anybody that's ever done anything musically over the past 20 or 30 years owes a sincere debt of gratitude to Whitney Elizabeth Houston. There's no Mariah Carey without Whitney Houston. There's no Leona Lewis without Whitney Houston. There is no anybody who's ever won American Idol over the past 20 years without Whitney Houston. There's no Kelly Clarkson without Whitney Houston. There's no Carrie Underwood without Whitney Houston. There's no Jennifer Hudson without Whitney Houston. There's no Sierra without Whitney Houston. There's no Beyonce without Whitney Houston. There's no Destiny's Child without Whitney Houston. All of those wonderful Black female groups that you saw in the 90s, like Allure and Vogue, Moke and Steph, 702, Brownstone, Jade, none of them happened without Whitney Houston. There has never been anyone like Whitney Houston. And quite frankly, we will never see another Whitney Houston ever again in our lifetimes or any future lifetimes. We may have singers that remind us of her. We may have singers that make us think about whoever that singer could be in comparison to Whitney. But nah, we're not going to have another Whitney. That's just Whitney's Whitney's in a space, place, and class all by herself. The closest singer that I've heard and seen to Whitney is Fantasia, who won American Idol about 12, probably 15 years ago. Fantasia is the closest that I've heard and seen to Whitney. And Fantasia can go. Don't fool yourself. Fantasia can sing all night long. And this is no disrespect to Fantasia at all. And I love, I mean, when you see Fantasia and you hear Fantasia, you know it's coming from in here. But I'll be willing to bet you that even Fantasia would probably say, "Hey, you know what? Whitney was different." And Fantasia, in my opinion, is in that conversation of truly transcendental and legendary Black female singer, not just Black female singer, but singer in general. When you think about a Celine Dion or a Mariah, or if we're going back a little further, a Barbara Streisand, or a Patti LaBelle, or a Shaka Khan, Shaka Khan. You could put Fantasia in that. She gets a seat at that table. And Whitney's at that table too, obviously. I want to read you all the lyrics to it's a song off of Whitney's first album. It's called The Greatest Love of All. Whitney says, or sings, or sung, I should say, "I believe that children are the future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Give them a sense of pride to make it easier. Let the children's laughter remind us how we used to be. Everybody's searching for a hero. People need someone to look up to. I'd never found anyone who fulfilled my needs. A lonely place to be. And so I learned to depend on me. I decided long ago never to walk in anyone's shadow. If I fail, if I succeed, at least I'll live as I believe. No matter what they take from me, they can't take away my dignity. Because the greatest love of all is happening to me. I found the greatest love of all inside of me. The greatest love of all is easy to achieve. Learning to love yourself is the greatest love of all." Then the remaining verses are repeats of the first two verses that I just recited. Then towards the end of the song, Whitney sings, "Because the greatest love of all is happening to me. I found the greatest love of all inside of me. The greatest love of all is easy to achieve. Learning to love yourself is the greatest love of all. And if by chance that special place that you've been dreaming of leads you to a lonely place. Find your strength in love. If you have 30 minutes or an hour today, jump on YouTube, look up a Whitney Houston playlist, let it soak in. Find your strength in love. That's all I have to say for today, everybody. I want to thank everybody that watched. Out to Eugene for chiming in on the comments. We miss you, Whitney. We love you, Whitney. We will continue to celebrate you and your music.